In 1846, the United States had only 7,500 regular soldiers. Mexico had more than 40,000. On paper, this was a war the Americans should not have won. But something happened in those 2 years that would change the map of the continent forever. A handful of men, underpaid, many of them immigrants who could barely speak English, marched deep into enemy territory, faced armies far larger than their own, crossed deserts, scaled walls, and planted the American flag in the heart of Mexico. This is the story of the Mexican-American War, a war forgotten by many, but one that shaped everything that came after, including the bloodiest war the United States would ever fight against itself. To understand this war, we need to go back a little. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain and inherited a vast territory stretching from what is now Oregon all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico in the southern part of North America. At the same time, the United States was growing at a rapid pace. The American population jumped from 2 million in 1780 to 12 million in 1830. With that growth, American settlers began crossing the border and establishing themselves in Mexican territory, especially in a region called Texas. Mexico allowed this, but with conditions. Settlers were expected to adopt Mexican citizenship and Roman Catholicism. Many ignored the rules, they brought slaves, they refused to integrate. And before long, Americans in Texas vastly outnumbered the Mexicans living there. Tensions kept rising until, in 1845, President James K. Polk pushed the annexation of Texas through Congress, making it the 28th state of the Union. Mexico viewed it as an act of war, and it would not be long before blood began to spill. But before we continue, if you are enjoying this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is free, it helps us a great deal, and it makes sure you never miss an episode. The story of the Mexican-American War begins long before the first shots were fired. When American settlers in Texas refused to follow Mexican law, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna marched north with his army to restore order. In 1836, he surrounded the Alamo, a fortified mission in San Antonio, with 2,800 soldiers. The defenders, fewer than 200 men, held out for 13 days before being completely wiped out. Among the dead were legendary figures such as Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. But Santa Anna's victory was short-lived. Just weeks later, Texan forces, led by Sam Houston, captured Santa Anna himself in an ambush. To secure his release, he signed a treaty recognizing the Republic of Texas. The moment he returned to Mexico, he renounced the agreement, claiming he had signed under duress. Texas was independent in practice, but lived under constant threat. The situation grew even more complicated with the presence of the Comanche, one of the most powerful indigenous tribes in the region. After years of conflict, Sam Houston made peace with the Comanche in 1844. The tribe then began raiding deeper into Mexican territory, trading stolen horses and livestock to Texans in exchange for guns. Mexico accused Texas of encouraging those raids. The question of annexing Texas divided the United States itself. The Democratic Party supported the idea. The Whig Party, which included many abolitionists, opposed it, fearing that a large slaveholding state would upset the political balance of the country. Even so, in March 1845, President Polk pushed annexation through Congress. Texas became the 28th state of the Union. With annexation came a new problem. Where exactly was the border? Texas claimed it ran along the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River further north. Between the two rivers lay a strip of disputed land, and it was there that the Mexican-American War would take its first real steps. In February 1846, President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor and roughly 4,000 men, approximately half of the entire U.S. Army at the time, to the northern bank of the Rio Grande. Taylor was known by the nickname Old Rough and Ready for his informal style of leadership. He was popular with the troops, even if one soldier described him as a short, heavy-set man who looked like a toad on horseback. But his courage and military instincts were beyond question. On the other side of the river, Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia demanded that Taylor withdraw. Taylor refused. On the 26th of April, 1846, Mexican forces crossed the river and ambushed an American patrol on a ranch in the disputed zone. Around 12 American soldiers were killed and the rest were captured. Taylor sent word to Polk with a direct message, "Hostilities may now be considered to have begun." Polk went to Congress asking for a declaration of war. His argument was straightforward. Mexico had invaded American territory and shed American blood on American soil. Not everyone agreed. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk to show exactly where that blood had been spilled. Some Whigs openly opposed the war. But public support was strong, and on the 13th of May, 1846, the declaration of war was signed. The numbers were daunting for the American side. Mexico had around 40,000 soldiers. The United States had only 7,500 regulars. The declaration of war called for doubling the regular army and raising 50,000 volunteers. Nearly half of all American soldiers were immigrants, especially Irish and German, drawn not by patriotism, but by the promise of food, shelter, and steady pay. What the Americans had in abundance was technology and organization, while Mexican troops carried outdated British muskets left over from the Napoleonic Wars and prone to misfiring the U.S. Army relied on light, mobile artillery pulled by horses. It was an innovation that would prove decisive in the open battles ahead. The Mexican-American War was only just beginning, and the Americans had far more than numbers on their side. The opening battles of the Mexican-American War quickly showed what American artillery could do. At Palo Alto, in May 1846, Taylor faced a much larger Mexican army in open terrain. The American cannons, fast and accurate, tore through enemy formations before the Mexicans could get close enough to use their slow, inaccurate muskets. The battle made one thing clear: numbers alone do not decide wars. Taylor won, and won decisively. Taylor pressed on into northern Mexico. In September 1846, his forces captured Monterrey after 3 days of intense street-by-street fighting. Then in February 1847, Santa Anna personally led around 20,000 men against Taylor at Buena Vista. Taylor had fewer than 5,000 soldiers. Even so, after 2 days of brutal fighting, the Americans held their ground and forced the Mexicans to retreat. It was one of the most impressive victories of the entire war. While Taylor was fighting in the north, Washington decided to open a second front. General Winfield Scott led a force of around 12,000 men in an amphibious landing at Vera Cruz on the Gulf of Mexico in March 1847. It was the largest operation of its kind ever carried out by the United States up to that point. After an 18-day siege, the city surrendered. The road to Mexico City was open. Scott then made a bold and risky decision. He cut his own supply lines and ordered a direct advance on the capital, living off whatever resources could be found along the way. It was a gamble that could have ended in total disaster. But Scott knew his army and knew the terrain. In August 1847, at the Battle of Contreras, his forces broke through, leaving Mexico City exposed. What had looked like suicide had become a masterstroke. Battle after battle, the Americans pushed the Mexicans back toward their own capital. Santa Anna tried to reorganize his defenses, but his generals were unreliable, his soldiers were exhausted, and his equipment kept failing. The Mexican-American War had begun, with Mexico holding a 5-to-1 advantage in troop numbers. Now, the American flag was about to be raised in the heart of Mexico. The last major obstacle before Mexico City was Chapultepec Castle, a fortress built on a hilltop that commanded the entire surrounding area. On the 12th of September 1847, Scott ordered the assault, Inside the castle were around 1,000 Mexican defenders, among them a group that would be forever remembered in Mexican history, the Ninos heroes, the Boy Heroes. They were military cadets, some as young as 13, who refused the order to retreat and chose to fight to the end. Legend holds that the last of them, Juan Escutia, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leaped from the top of the castle so the Americans could not capture it. Fact or legend, the act became one of the most powerful symbols of Mexican national identity. For the Americans, Chapultepec was one more military victory. For the Mexicans, it was a wound that never fully healed. That same day, another defining episode took place. The St. Patrick's Battalion was made up of dozens of Irish soldiers and men of other nationalities who had deserted the U.S. Army and fought for Mexico instead. Many were Catholic and felt a deeper connection to the Mexican cause. When Chapultepec fell, 30 members of the battalion were hanged at the exact moment the American flag rose above the castle. It was an execution deliberately timed to be witnessed by all. On the 14th of September, 1847, American troops entered Mexico City. Santa Anna attempted to resist with guerrilla tactics for another month, but the war was effectively over. Mexico, exhausted and without a stable government, needed peace. The United States, emerging victorious from the Mexican-American War, was ready to set the term. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in February 1848. Under its terms, Mexico gave up more than half of its territory to the United States. Not just Texas, but also what are today California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado. In return, the U.S. paid $15 million. In the blink of an eye, the United States grew by 500,000 square miles. Manifest destiny had been fulfilled, but the consequences ran deep for both nations. Mexico fell into a spiral of instability that opened the door to dictatorships, civil wars, and even a French invasion. As for the United States, despite the victory, it carried a ticking time bomb. The expansion of territory reignited the debate over slavery in the new states. Less than 15 years later, many of the soldiers who had fought side by side in the Mexican-American War would find themselves on opposite sides of an even more devastating conflict, the American Civil War. The Mexican-American War lasted less than 2 years, but its consequences shaped the continent for centuries. A small army made up of ordinary men, farmers, immigrants, volunteers who had never seen a battlefield, faced far larger forces, and came out victorious. Generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott proved that leadership, technology, and determination can overcome any disadvantage in numbers. And the map we know today, with the United States stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, is largely the result of that war. It is a story of courage, ambition, and unintended consequences. A war that many Americans do not know, yet one that lies at the root of so much, from the border with Mexico to the tensions that led to the Civil War. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This kind of history deserves to be told and remembered. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel. It is the best way to support us, and make sure more stories like this one keep coming your way.